Section 10. The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 3, Chapter 2. Application of the preceding principles to the comparative study of the evolution of the United States of America and of the Spanish-American republics. The English character, how the American soul has been formed, severity of the selection resulting from the conditions of existence, forced disappearance of the inferior elements, the Negroes and the Chinese, reasons of the prosperity of the United States and of the decadence of the Spanish-American republics in spite of identical political institutions, inevitable anarchy of the Spanish-American republics as a consequence of the inferiority of the characteristics of the race. The brief considerations which precede show that the institutions of a people are the expression of its soul, and that while it is easy for a people to change their form, it is impossible for it to change their essence. We are now going to show by very precise examples to what a degree the soul of a people determines its destiny, and how insignificant is the role played by institutions in this destiny. Footnote: the illustrious English sociologist Herbert Spencer had neglected in his great works the influence of the character of peoples on their destinies, and his admirable theoretical synthesis had led him at first to very optimistic conclusions. Having decided as he became older to take into consideration the fundamental role of character, he has had to modify entirely his earlier conclusions, and has finally been brought to substitute for them extremely pessimistic conclusions. We find them expressed in a recently published discourse on Tyndall, reprinted in the Revue de Reviews. Here are some extracts. Quote, "My faith in free institutions, so strong to begin with, has considerably diminished of late years. We are going back to the regime of the iron hand represented by the bureaucratic despotism of a socialist organization, and then by the military despotism which will succeed it, supposing this latter not be realized suddenly as the outcome of some acute social crisis." Unquote. End of footnote. I shall go for these examples to a country in which there exist side by side, under conditions of environment but slightly different, two European races equally civilized and intelligent, and only differing as regards their character. I refer to America. This continent is formed by two distinct continents united by an isthmus. The superficies of each of these continents is very nearly equal, and their soil not at all unlike. One of them has been conquered and peopled by the English, the other by the Spanish race. These two races live under similar republican institutions, since the republics of South America have always modelled their institutions on those of the United States. In consequence, to explain the different destinies of these peoples, we have nothing to go on but racial differences. Let us consider the results these differences have produced. To begin with, let us summarize in a few words the characteristics of the Anglo-Saxon race which has peopled the United States. There is no race, perhaps, in the world which is so homogeneous, and whose mental constitution it is so easy to define in its main lines. The dominant features of this mental constitution from the point of view of character are a degree of willpower which very few peoples, with the exception perhaps of the Romans, have possessed, an indomitable energy, very great initiative, absolute self-control, a sentiment of independence carried to the pitch of excessive unsociability, immense activity, very lively religious sentiments, a very stable morality, and a very clear idea of duty. From the intellectual point of view, it is impossible to give special characteristics, that is to say, to point out special elements not to be found in the other civilized nations. There is little to note beyond a sureness of judgment which allows of the grasping of the practical and positive side of things, and keeps those who possess it from losing their way in chimerical researches. A strong liking for facts and but little taste for general ideas, a certain narrowness of mind which prevents the recognition of the weak sides of religious beliefs, and in consequence ensures those beliefs escaping discussion. To these general characteristics must be added a complete optimism with regard to the path the individual has traced himself in life, which leads him never even to suppose that he could possibly have chosen a better. He is always aware of what is demanded of him by his country, his family, his gods. This optimism is carried to the pitch of regarding whatever is foreign as extremely contemptible. Contempt for the foreigner and his customs certainly surpasses in England that formerly professed by the Romans and barbarians at the time of their greatness. So great is it that as regards the foreigner every rule of morality ceases to hold good. There is not an English statesman who does not consider as perfectly legitimate in his conduct towards other peoples acts which would provoke the deepest and the most unanimous indignation if they were practised where his countrymen were concerned. This contempt for the foreigner is doubtless a sentiment of a very inferior order from the philosophic point of view, but from the point of view of the prosperity of a people it is extremely useful. As Lord Wolseley, the well-known English general, has rightly remarked, it is one of the sentiments that make the strength of England. It has been said with reason in connection with their refusal, their very judicious refusal be it remarked, to allow the construction of a tunnel under the Channel which would facilitate communications with the continent, that the English take as much trouble as the Chinese to prevent the penetration into their country of all foreign influence. All the characteristics which have just been enumerated are met with in the various social grades. It would be impossible to light on any element of English civilization on which they have not left their mark. The foreigner who visits England, if only for a few days, is at once struck by this fact. He will note the desire for an independent life in the cottage of the most humble employee, a confined dwelling, no doubt, but in which the householder is exposed to no restraint and is isolated from his neighbours. In the busiest railway stations, in which the public is free to circulate at all hours, not being penned in like a flock of docile sheep behind a barrier guarded by an employee, as if it were necessary to assure by force the security of people, incapable themselves of the amount of attention necessary to keep them from being run over. He will recognize the energy of the race in the laboriousness of the workman, or in that of the schoolboy. Left to himself while still quite young, and learning to look after himself without assistance, he being already well aware that in the course of his existence nobody will be concerned with his fate. In the schoolmasters who set comparatively little store on learning, but attach great importance to character, which they hold to be one of the great motive forces of the world. Entrusted by the Queen of England with deciding the conditions on which the annual prize given by her to Wellington College should be awarded, Prince Albert ordered that it should be granted not to the scholar who had done best in his studies, but to the boy of best character. In the case of a Latin nation, the prize would certainly have been given to the pupil who repeated best what he had learned from his books. All our education, including what we term higher education, consists in making our youth recite lessons. The scholars retain the habit to such a degree that they continue to recite them during the rest of their existence. When he studies the public life of the citizen, he will see that it is not to the state but to private initiative that appeal is always made, whether it is a case of repairing a fountain or of constructing a harbour or a railway. Pursuing his inquiry, he will soon recognize that this people, in spite of defects which make it the most insufferable of peoples in the eyes of foreigners, is the only really free people, because it is the only people which, having learned to govern itself, has been able to leave only a minimum of action to its government. If its history be studied, it is seen that it was the first people to free itself from every kind of domination, from that of the Church as well as from that of kings. As early as the 15th century, the legist Fortescue contrasted, "the Roman law, the inheritance of the Latin peoples, with the English law, the one the work of absolute sovereigns, and wholly inclined to sacrifice the individual, the other the work of the will of the community, and ever ready to protect the individual." To whatever quarter of the globe such a people may emigrate, it will at once acquire the preponderance and found powerful empires. If the race it invades, as in the case of the Redskins of America, for example, is sufficiently weak and insufficiently utilizable, it will be methodically exterminated. If the race invaded, as in the case of the population of India, is too numerous to be destroyed and is capable, moreover, of doing productive work, it will simply be reduced to a very oppressive state of vassalage and obliged to labour for the almost exclusive advantage of its masters. It is more especially, however, in a new country such as America, that the astonishing progress due to the mental constitution of the English race should be studied. Transported into uncultivated regions sparsely inhabited by some few savages, it is notorious what its destiny has been. Scarcely a century has been necessary to raise the country to the front rank among the great powers of the world, and today there are few powers that would be a match for it. I advise those who are desirous of appreciating for themselves the enormous sum of initiative and individual energy expended by the citizens of the great republic to read the books of M. Rossier and Paul Bourget. The aptitude of the Americans to govern themselves, to unite together to found great enterprises, to create towns, schools, harbours, railways, etc., has arrived at such a pitch, and the action of the state has been reduced to such a minimum, that it might almost be said that no public authorities exist. Apart from filling police duties and those of diplomatic representation, it is even difficult to see what purpose they could serve. It is impossible, moreover, for an individual to prosper in the United States except on the condition that he possesses the qualities of character I have just described, and this is why the foreign immigrations are powerless to modify the general trend of mind of the race. The conditions of existence are such that the individuals who do not possess these qualities are condemned to disappear at an early date. Only the Anglo-Saxon can live in this atmosphere saturated with independence and energy. The Italian dies of starvation, and the Irishman and the Negro vegetate in the most humble situations. The great republic is assuredly the land of liberty. It is assuredly the land neither of equality nor of fraternity, those two Latin chimeras which the laws of progress do not recognize. In no country on the globe has natural selection made its iron arm more rudely felt. It is unpitying, but it is precisely because it ignores pity that the race it has contributed to form retains its power and energy. There is no room for the weak, the mediocre, the incapable on the soil of the United States. By the mere fact that they are inferior, isolated individuals or entire races are destined to perish. The red-skin Indians, because useless, have been shot down or condemned to die of hunger. The Chinese workmen, whose labour constitutes a vexatious source of competition, will soon undergo a similar fate. The law decreeing their total expulsion has not been carried out because of the enormous expenses its application would entail. Footnote: the 53rd Congress only adjourned the execution of the Gary Law, Chinese Exclusion Act, because it found that to convey 100,000 Chinamen back to their country would involve an expenditure of 30 millions of francs, whereas the sum voted for the expulsion of the Chinese workmen was only 100,000 francs. End of footnote. Its place will doubtless soon be taken by a methodical destruction, already begun in several mining districts. Other laws have recently been voted, forbidding pauper emigrants to land on American territory. As to the Negroes who served as the pretext for the War of Succession, a war between those who possessed slaves and those who, being unable to possess them, did not wish to allow others to own them, they are almost tolerated because they fill none but subordinate positions which no American citizen would consent to accept. Theoretically they have rights, practically they are treated like semi-useful animals who are got rid of as soon as they become dangerous. The summary proceedings of lynch law are universally recognized to meet their case. At their first crime of any gravity they are shot or hanged. Statistics which only include a portion of these executions give over 1,000 for the last 7 years. These are doubtless the gloomy sides of the picture. It is brilliant enough to support them. If it were required to define in a word the difference between continental Europe and the United States, it might be said that the first represents the maximum of what can result from official regulation replacing individual initiative, the second the maximum of what can be effected by individual initiative entirely freed from all official regulation. These fundamental differences are exclusively the consequences of character. It is not on the soil of the rude republic that European socialism has a chance of implanting itself. The ultimate expression of state tyranny, it can only prosper among old races, subjected for centuries to a regime which has deprived them of all capacity for self-government. Footnote: the America I have just described is the America of yesterday and today, but it doubtless will not be that of tomorrow. We shall see in a forthcoming chapter that the country is threatened, in consequence of its recent invasion, by an immense number of inferior and unassimilable elements, by a gigantic civil war, which may be followed by its division into several independent states, always fighting amongst themselves as are those of Europe. End of footnote. We have just seen what has been accomplished in one portion of America by a race possessing a mental constitution of which the dominant features are perseverance, energy, and strength of will. It remains for us to show what has become of an almost similar country in the hands of another race, which, though highly intelligent, possesses none of the qualities of character whose effects I have just noted. South America, as regards its natural productions, is one of the richest countries of the globe. Twice as large as Europe and 10 times less inhabited, there is no lack of land which is, so to speak, at the disposition of everybody. The dominant population, which is of Spanish origin, is divided into numerous republics. The republics of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, etc., all of them have adopted the political constitution of the United States and live in consequence under identical laws. And yet, by the mere fact that the race is different and lacks the fundamental qualities possessed by the people of the United States, all these republics, without a single exception, are perpetually a prey to the most sanguinary anarchy, and in spite of the astonishing richness of their soil, they are victims one after the other of every sort of political and economic disaster, of bankruptcy and despotism. To appreciate the lengths reached by the decadence of the Spanish-American republics, the remarkable and impartial work on the subject of T.H. Child must be read. The causes of this decadence lie entirely in the mental constitution of a race possessing neither energy, strength of will, nor morality. The absence of morality, in particular, surpasses all we know that is worst in Europe. Citing one of the most important towns, Buenos Aires, the author declares it to be uninhabitable by anybody of any delicacy of conscience or morality. In reference to one of the least degraded of the republics, the Argentine Republic, the same writer adds, quote, "If this republic be studied from the commercial point of view, one is dumbfounded by the blatant immorality that is to be met with in every direction." Unquote. As to the institutions, there is no better example of how wholly they are the offspring of the race, and of the impossibility of transplanting them from one people to another. It was of great interest to know what would happen to the very liberal institutions of the United States after their introduction among an inferior race. Quote, "These countries," unquote, M. Child informs us of the various Spanish-American republics, quote, "are under the ferule of presidents who exercised an autocracy not less absolute than that of the Tsar of all the Russias. More absolute indeed, for they have nothing to fear from the importunities and the influence of European censure. The government officials are solely recruited from amongst their creatures. The citizens vote as they choose, but no account is paid to their votes. The Argentine Republic is a republic in name only. In reality, it is an oligarchy in the hands of persons who make a commerce of politics." Unquote. Only one country, Brazil, had to some extent escaped this decadence, thanks to a monarchical regime which kept the central authority from being the object of individual rivalries. The constitution too liberal for races without energy and without will has ended by succumbing. The result is that the country is a prey to utter anarchy. In the lapse of a few years, the dilapidation of the public finances by those in power has been such that the taxes have had to be increased by over 60%. Naturally, it is not in politics only that the decadence is manifest of the Latin race by which South America is peopled, but in all the other elements of civilization as well. Left to themselves, these hapless republicans would revert to pure barbarism. All their industry and commerce is in the hands of foreigners, of Englishmen, Americans, and Germans. Valparaiso has become an English city, and nothing would remain of Chile if the foreign element were to disappear. It is thanks to the foreigner that these countries still retain their external varnish of civilization that still deceives Europe. The Argentine Republic counts 4 millions of whites of Spanish origin. I doubt whether a single white man, apart from foreigners, could be cited at the head of an important industry. This terrible decadence of the Latin race, left to itself, compared with the prosperity of the English race in a neighbouring country, is one of the most sombre, the saddest, and at the same time the most instructive experiences that can be cited in support of the psychological laws that I have enunciated. End of section 10.